In the eerie stillness of a secluded forest, whispers drift through the trees, carrying secrets that beckon to be uncovered. Voices in the Woods invites readers into a haunting journey where reality blurs with the supernatural. When Sarah, a curious soul drawn to the forest's depths, encounters a mysterious hollow, she unwittingly awakens the spirits trapped within, each voice a fragment of lost stories yearning for release. As the whispers grow louder and the shadows deepen, she must confront her own fears and the dark history of the woods. This chilling tale explores the intersection of memory, longing, and the untold stories that linger in forgotten places. Will Sarah unravel the mysteries of the hollow, or will the voices consume her? Step into the woods and discover the echoes of the past that refuse to be silenced. Let's begin the story with the first chapter, Whispers Beyond the Trees. The forest loomed over the town of Hollow Creek like a dark shadow, an ancient presence that the townspeople rarely spoke of. Its trees stood tall and thick, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting a perpetual twilight beneath the leaves. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, where every breeze carried the faint scent of decay, and every rustle among the undergrowth hinted at something just out of sight. The locals had learned to keep their distance, letting the woods keep its secrets. On the outskirts of Hollow Creek, Sarah Bradford lived alone in a small, weathered cottage, surrounded by the dense woods that no one dared to explore. She had grown up hearing the tales, the warnings passed down from generation to generation, stories of the voices that called out from the trees, luring those who listened too closely into the darkness. But to Sarah, they had always been just that, stories. Superstitions designed to keep children from wandering too far from home. The forest had never frightened her, not really. Its silence had become a comfort to her over the years, a retreat from the noise of life and its endless demands. But lately, that silence had shifted. There were new sounds, faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to dance on the edge of hearing. At first, she had dismissed them as the wind or the calls of nocturnal creatures, but as the nights grew colder and the whispers more insistent, she couldn't shake the feeling that they carried a strange, unnatural intent. One chilly evening, as the last rays of sunlight bled away and the woods took on a deeper shade of darkness, Sarah stood on her porch, gazing into the trees. The air was thick with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and a low mist curled around the roots, creeping across the forest floor like a living thing. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, trying to ignore the unease prickling at the back of her mind. Yet she found herself straining to hear, wondering if the whispers would come again. As dusk settled fully, a breeze stirred the branches, sending a cascade of dried leaves skittering across the ground. Then she heard it, soft, barely more than a breath, but undeniably there. The sound drifted from the shadows, slipping through the gaps between the trees. It was not the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. The cadence of the whispers seemed to rise and fall, forming a pattern that sent a chill down her spine. She strained to catch the words, but they remained elusive, like the memory of a half-forgotten dream. Sarah took a step back, her heart thudding in her chest as the whispering continued, curling around her like tendrils of fog. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, its ancient presence far more tangible than it had ever been before. The trees, which she had once seen as silent sentinels, now seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the whispers themselves, as if they too harbored secrets that no human was meant to know. She tried to tear her gaze away from the darkened path that wound deeper into the woods, but something held her in place. A pull, a sense that the whispers were calling to her, beckoning her to step beyond the boundary where light and warmth faded. She shuddered, fighting the strange compulsion, and finally turned away, retreating into the safety of her cottage. Yet, Even behind the closed door, the whispers seemed to seep through the walls, a distant murmur that filled the empty spaces of her home. That night, sleep did not come easily. She lay awake, her mind replaying the sound she had heard, imagining shapes moving in the darkness beyond her window. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like an encroaching presence, pressing against the thin barrier of her home. She thought of the stories, the old warnings about the wood's hunger, and wondered if there had been more truth in them than she had ever believed. As the hours crawled by, the whispers grew fainter but never entirely disappeared. They lingered like a melody she could not quite recall, slipping into her thoughts even as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. And in her dreams, the trees closed in, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers, and she saw shadows moving between the trunks, shadows with eyes that glowed like embers, watching her, waiting for her to step into their domain. When morning came, the sunlight felt thin and insubstantial, struggling to penetrate the gloom that clung to the woods. Sarah woke with a sense of dread coiled tightly in her chest, the memory of her dreams and the whispers leaving her uneasy. She busied herself with chores around the cottage, trying to shake off the lingering fear, but her thoughts kept returning to the previous night, to the voice that seemed to reach out from the darkness. She ventured to the edge of the woods, peering into the depths where the mist still lingered, clinging to the roots and weaving through the undergrowth. The forest seemed different in the daylight, quieter, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the sun to dip below the horizon again. She knelt to examine a patch of earth near the tree-line, noticing something strange. The ground, soft from the previous night's rain, bore no footprints, no sign that any living creature had moved through. Yet she felt the undeniable sense of being watched, as if the forest itself had eyes. Sarah straightened, her skin prickling with the awareness that she was not alone, that perhaps she never truly had been. As she turned to leave, she caught a fleeting movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, too quick to follow, too vague to define. It was gone before she could even register what she had seen, leaving her heart pounding and her breath shallow. She hurried back to her cottage, glancing over her shoulder more than once, but the woods remained still, silent, as if mocking her fear. Yet deep within, she knew that something had changed. The boundary between the forest and her world was thinning, and whatever lay within the shadows was growing bolder, more willing to reach out beyond the trees. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the woods darkened once more, Sarah found herself standing at her window, staring into the inky blackness beyond. The whispers returned, drifting through the twilight like a half-formed question. The chill that settled in her bones felt different now, a recognition that she was standing on the edge of something far deeper and more ancient than she could comprehend. And as she listened, the words began to take shape in her mind, not spoken, but understood, as if the forest itself was planting thoughts within her. She knew then that the voices were waiting for her, calling her deeper into their embrace. But whether they carried promises or threats, she could not yet discern. All she knew was that the woods had awoken, and whatever secrets they held, they would not remain hidden for much longer. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Shadows. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy of the woods, but the sunlight seemed weaker here, thin and pale, barely touching the damp earth below. The shadows between the trees remained dark and deep, like stains that no amount of daylight could cleanse. The air carried a chill that clung to Sarah Bradford's skin, colder than it should have been in the late autumn. She busied herself with gathering firewood, her thoughts heavy with the unsettling events of the previous night. As she stacked the wood near her cottage, her eyes kept straying to the forest's edge, to the path that wound deeper into the trees. It was as if an invisible thread tugged at her, pulling her gaze toward the shadows that clung to the ancient oaks and pines. The whispers had been silent throughout the morning, but their memory lingered, like a sound just beyond her hearing, a presence she couldn't shake. She forced herself to focus on the mundane tasks of the day, chopping the firewood, tending to the small vegetable garden behind her cottage, and making herself a simple meal. But even as she worked, she couldn't ignore the way the woods seemed to watch her. The trees stood unnaturally still, the air within them thick and unmoving, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. The mist that had shrouded the forest the previous night was gone, yet the sense of being observed had only grown stronger. By midday, Sarah decided to venture a little further into the woods, hoping to reassure herself that there was nothing to fear, that the strange occurrences were merely tricks of her imagination. She told herself it was just curiosity, but deep down, she knew it was something more, a compulsion, a desire to understand what lay beyond the tree's dark embrace. She grabbed a lantern from the porch, even though the daylight had yet to fade, and stepped onto the narrow trail leading into the forest. The deeper she walked, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, faded into an oppressive silence. Her footsteps crunched against the fallen leaves, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She walked until her cottage was out of sight, replaced by a sea of gnarled trunks and shadowed undergrowth, and still, the forest seemed to swallow every noise, leaving her feeling small and vulnerable beneath the looming trees. She paused near an ancient oak, its roots tangled and exposed like veins, twisting through the dark soil. She knelt down, running her fingers over the rough bark, feeling the cold that seeped from the tree into her skin. It was then that she noticed something, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a heartbeat. It seemed to throb through the earth, through the roots, a rhythm that pulsed just beneath the surface. She pressed her ear against the bark, listening intently, her breath held tight in her chest. The sound was there, deep and steady, but it wasn't a heartbeat. It was more like a vibration, a hum that resonated through the ground, as if the forest itself was alive and restless. Sarah's skin prickled with unease, a shiver running down her spine. She pushed herself away from the tree, stumbling slightly as she stood, her hands shaking. The air around her felt colder than before, as if the forest had drawn the warmth from the sun and buried it deep within its roots. As she turned to head back, she caught sight of a shadow moving through the trees, flitting between the trunks like a fleeting breath. It was there and then gone, too quick to be a trick of the light, too solid to be dismissed as a figment of her imagination. Her heart pounded in her chest, her skin clammy with a sudden sweat. She scanned the forest, searching for any sign of movement, but the shadows remained still, frozen in place as if they had never moved at all. She took a shaky breath and forced herself to walk back toward the cottage, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her mind raced with possibilities, animals, stray hikers, tricks of the mind. But no matter how she tried to rationalize what she had seen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that watched her with a silent, patient hunger. As she reached the edge of the woods, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing deep within the shadows, just beyond the reach of the dim afternoon light. A tall, dark silhouette, its outline blurred among the trees. She blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness that thickened between the trunks. Her hands tightened around the handle of the lantern, and she quickened her pace, feeling a prickle of cold sweat at the back of her neck. She made it back to the cottage just as the sun began to dip behind the treetops, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing. The warmth of the fire inside offered little comfort, as if the chill of the woods had seeped into her bones and refused to let go. She kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see those shadows again, lurking at the edge of the trees. But all she saw was the growing darkness, the twilight seeping into the world like ink. Night fell slowly, dragging with it a sense of dread that weighed heavily on her chest. The forest, hidden behind the veil of darkness, seemed to press closer, like a living thing wrapping itself around her home. She tried to distract herself with her chores, but every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the windows made her start, her heart leaping into her throat. When she finally allowed herself to rest, lying in bed with the blankets pulled tightly around her, she heard the whispers again. Faint, just on the edge of perception, slipping through the gaps in the wooden walls like threads of sound. They seemed to call from every direction, forming a melody of half-formed words and breathless sighs. Her mind strained to catch their meaning, but they remained elusive, like a language that danced just beyond understanding. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, to focus on the warmth of the blankets and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. But the whispers persisted, growing louder as the night deepened. She could feel them pressing against her thoughts, tugging at the edges of her mind, as if they were trying to burrow inside, to plant their seeds within her dreams. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by visions of dark woods and shifting shadows. In her dreams, she walked among the trees, following a path that twisted and turned through a landscape that was both familiar and alien. The whispers surrounded her, filling the air like a mist, thickening until she could no longer see the sky. And in the distance, she saw the figure again, standing motionless among the trees, its face hidden by darkness. It raised a hand, beckoning her forward, and she felt her feet moving of their own accord, carrying her deeper into the shadows. When she awoke, drenched in sweat, the whispers had finally stopped, leaving the cottage in a silence that felt more unsettling than their presence. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the lingering images from her mind. But the sense of unease clung to her like a second skin, refusing to fade with the dawn. She knew then that the forest was not finished with her, that whatever presence lingered among the trees had grown curious about her, just as she had become curious about it. The morning air was cold and damp as she stepped outside, the frost glistening on the fallen leaves. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her back, an unspoken challenge in the stillness of the trees. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer, that the whispers, the shadows, the strange sense of presence, they were all leading her towards something deeper within the woods, something that waited in the darkness beyond. And she had the sinking feeling that if she did not confront it soon, it would find its own way to her doorstep. Chapter 3. The Hollow Murmurs. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick veil of mist that had settled over the woods, casting a pale glow that barely touched the forest floor. Sarah Bradford awoke to a damp chill that seeped through the walls of her cottage, a reminder that the season was shifting, bringing with it the creeping cold of winter. She wrapped herself in an old woolen shawl, her breath visible in the crisp air as she moved about the cottage, trying to shake off the remnants of last night's troubling dreams. Outside, the world seemed muted, the forest shrouded in a blanket of fog that obscured the trees and blurred the edges of reality. It felt as though the woods were trying to hide something, to fold in on themselves, creating a space where the usual laws of nature no longer applied. The air tasted of decay and damp earth, carrying with it a scent that was strangely sweet, like rotting leaves mixed with something metallic. She tried to keep busy with her morning tasks, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the shadows she had glimpsed among the trees, to the strange vibrations she had felt through the ancient oak. Despite the unease that clung to her, a part of her felt drawn back to that place, to the dark heart of the forest where the whispers seemed to gather like a swarm of unseen insects. By late morning, She could no longer resist the pull. She gathered a few supplies, a lantern, a small hunting knife, a flask of water, and set off down the narrow trail that wound into the woods. Each step took her further from the safety of her cottage, deeper into the maze of trunks and twisted roots. The mist thickened around her, turning the world into a shifting mass of shapes and shadows, so that she could barely see more than a few feet ahead. As she walked, she noticed that the forest had changed. The trees, which had always been familiar and solid, now seemed distorted, their branches twisting into unnatural angles, their trunks warped as if they had been bent by some unseen force. The ground underfoot was spongy and uneven, and she stumbled more than once, catching herself on the rough bark of a tree or a protruding root. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed to hum with a low, thrumming sound, like the distant buzz of a power line. It was barely audible, more a vibration than a noise, but it set her teeth on edge, made her feel as though the forest itself was breathing around her. The sensation was unsettling, as if the woods were trying to communicate, speaking in a language she couldn't quite understand. She came to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a space where the ground dipped into a shallow hollow. The mist seemed thicker here, pooling in the depression like water, swirling in slow, deliberate currents. She hesitated at the edge, feeling a chill seep into her bones, but curiosity pushed her forward. She descended into the hollow, the mist rising around her like tendrils, curling against her skin. At the center of the hollow, she found something that made her breath catch. A series of strange symbols had been carved into the earth, arranged in a circular pattern that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. The carvings were deep, precise, and unlike any she had ever seen. Jagged lines that twisted into shapes that hurt to look at for too long. The earth around them was scorched, as if the symbols had been burned into the ground with a heat too intense to imagine. She knelt beside the nearest symbol, running her fingers over the blackened edges. The soil was cool to the touch, but there was a faint warmth that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, like the fading embers of a fire. A shiver crawled up her spine, and she pulled her hand away, feeling as though she had touched something that should not be disturbed. Her mind buzzed with questions, but the silence of the woods pressed against her thoughts, stifling any coherent answers. The only certainty was that these symbols had not appeared naturally. Someone, or something, had placed them here, had inscribed them into the earth with a purpose she could not fathom. And whatever that purpose was, she had the sense that it had been lying dormant, waiting for something, or someone, to awaken it. As she stood, the mist thickened around her, turning the clearing into a gray, featureless void. The trees at the edge of the hollow faded into shadows, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, as if the world itself was tilting beneath her feet. She gripped the handle of her lantern tightly, the metal cool and solid against her skin, grounding her in this place that seemed to be slipping away from reality. That was when she heard the murmurs, soft, like the rustling of dry leaves, but with a cadence that suggested words, language. They rose from the earth itself, slipping through the mist and twining around her thoughts, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. They seemed to come from all directions, filling the hollow with their insidious whispers, making her feel as though she was standing in the center of a great, unseen presence. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent, burrowing into her mind like roots pushing through soft soil. She felt herself swaying on her feet, the ground beneath her shifting, as if the forest was trying to draw her down into its depths, to wrap her in its roots and shadows. With a sudden, desperate effort, she tore herself away from the center of the clearing, stumbling up the slope and back onto the trail. The murmurs faded as she put distance between herself and the hollow, but the sensation of being watched, of being followed, lingered long after the last whisper had died away. She cast a glance back over her shoulder, half expecting to see something moving through the mist, but the forest remained still, a wall of shadows and twisted branches. When she finally reached the edge of the woods, the sun was setting, casting long, crimson rays through the thinning mist. Her hands were trembling as she fumbled with the latch of her cottage door, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She locked the door behind her, throwing the bolt for the first time since she had moved into the cottage, feeling a chill settle in her bones that no fire could warm. She sat by the hearth, her mind spinning with the images of the strange symbols, the unnatural whispers that had filled the hollow. She tried to make sense of it, to weave the fragments of her experience into a narrative that fit within the world she knew. But the forest had shifted the boundaries of reality, had shown her a side of itself that defied explanation. As the fire crackled in the grate, she turned the symbols over in her mind, tracing their lines with her thoughts, feeling their shapes resonate with a power that had no place in the waking world. She knew that she should stay away, that whatever lay at the heart of the woods was not meant to be disturbed. But even as she made this resolution, a part of her yearned to return, to decipher the mystery that pulsed beneath the roots and shadows, to uncover the truth that the forest seemed so eager to hide. She sat in the flickering firelight, staring into the darkness beyond the window, knowing that sleep would not come easily that night. The voices, the shadows, the strange vibrations, they had begun to weave themselves into her thoughts, to root themselves within her mind like seeds planted in fertile ground. And as the last light of day faded from the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was waiting for her, that it had always been waiting, and that now it had finally begun to reveal its secrets. Chapter 4. The Shifting Shadows. The next morning dawned with an unnatural stillness. The usual chorus of morning birdsong was absent, leaving a silence that felt too complete, as if the woods were holding their breath. Sarah Bradford woke early, the memory of yesterday's encounter with the hollow fresh in her mind. Despite the warm rays of the sun piercing through the window, a chill lingered in the corners of the cottage, a cold that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. She gathered her thoughts over a cup of bitter coffee, the steam rising in thin curls into the cool air. Her hands, wrapped around the mug, felt like they were holding on to the last bit of warmth, a barrier against the chill that had settled into her bones. But she couldn't ignore the pull that seemed to call her back into the forest, a strange compulsion that she couldn't fully understand. As she prepared to venture back into the woods, a heaviness weighed on her chest, a sense of foreboding that she tried to shake off as mere imagination. She reminded herself that she was simply curious, that the rational part of her mind sought explanations. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The forest had become a mystery she couldn't ignore, a puzzle that tugged at the edges of her thoughts. With each step she took along the trail, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, stretching out like skeletal fingers across the path. The leaves underfoot were damp from the morning dew, their edges curling as if they were trying to retreat into themselves. The air carried a scent of decay, mingling with the sharp tang of pine and wet earth. The sun, though high in the sky, did little to penetrate the dense canopy overhead, leaving the forest in a perpetual twilight. As she walked deeper, she noticed that the trees appeared to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. They seemed to lean inwards, crowding the path, their trunks twisted into shapes that defied nature. It was as though the forest itself was alive, reshaping its form in response to her presence, closing in around her like a living thing. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the swaying branches and the whispers of the wind. The path narrowed as she approached the clearing where she had found the strange symbols. The trees here grew taller, their bark rough and scarred, as if they had witnessed countless seasons of harsh weather and ancient storms. The mist had returned, creeping through the underbrush, swirling around her legs like a living thing. She stepped carefully, feeling the weight of each footfall, the ground soft and yielding beneath her boots. When she reached the edge of the hollow, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. The symbols were still there, etched into the earth, their lines blackened and precise. But now, there were more of them. New patterns that radiated outward from the original circle, forming a web-like design that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. The air above them shimmered, as if heated by an invisible fire, distorting the mist that hovered over the ground. Sarah knelt beside the symbols, her fingers hovering just above the scorched earth. The warmth she had felt before was stronger now, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. She pressed her palm against the soil, expecting to feel heat, but the ground was cold, as if the energy that radiated from the symbols did not belong to this world. She withdrew her hand, staring at the intricate patterns, trying to make sense of their meaning. The shapes seemed to shift when she looked at them, the lines bending and twisting into new configurations, as though they were rearranging themselves before her eyes. It was as if the symbols were alive, their meanings fluid, shifting with the thoughts that crowded her mind. Suddenly, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision, a fleeting shape that slipped between the trees. She stood quickly, her pulse quickening, scanning the forest around her. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to deepen, pooling into shapes that flickered and writhed like living creatures. She strained her eyes, trying to distinguish the movement from the tricks of light and shadow, but the shapes dissolved into the mist before she could focus on them. The hollow felt different today, more oppressive, as if the very air had thickened with an unseen presence. She could feel it pressing down on her, a weight that made it difficult to breathe, that sent a cold sweat trickling down the back of her neck. She turned away from the hollow, forcing herself to step back onto the path, her body tense with the effort of resisting the urge to look back. As she walked, the forest seemed to shift around her. The path, once familiar, became twisted, leading her in circles that made her question whether she had wandered off course. The trees loomed taller, their branches interlocking overhead like a web of shadows. The mist swirled thicker, clinging to her skin, turning the world into a gray blur. She could hear the faint murmurs again, drifting through the air like echoes from a distant past, words she could not understand. The whispers seemed to follow her, growing louder the further she walked, until they formed a soft, rhythmic chant. It was a sound that made her feel as though she was being pulled towards something, drawn deeper into the heart of the woods. The chant seemed to seep into her mind, latching onto her thoughts like a parasite, feeding on her fear and confusion. Her steps quickened, driven by a rising panic that she tried to suppress. She needed to get out, to break free from the maze of shadows and mist, to find her way back to the sunlit world beyond the forest's edge. But the path kept twisting beneath her feet, leading her back to the same trees, the same gnarled roots that snagged her boots. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a clearing she did not recognize. A place where the trees opened up to reveal a patch of sky, streaked with the orange and purple hues of dusk. The shadows stretched long across the ground, their edges sharp and jagged, casting shapes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs aching from the unrelenting pace, but the whispers had finally receded, leaving behind an eerie silence. She sank to her knees, pressing her hands against the cool earth, her thoughts spinning with the memory of the shifting paths and the strange symbols. She felt as though the forest had played a game with her, had twisted its paths to test her resolve, to see how far she was willing to go. And as she knelt there, surrounded by the deepening shadows, She couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a threshold, that she had ventured too deep into the woods and uncovered something that had lain hidden for far too long. The last rays of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the forest in darkness. The night seemed to descend faster than it should have, swallowing up the clearing in shadows that crept towards her like living things. She fumbled with her lantern, the flame flickering to life, casting a weak, trembling light against the darkness. But even with the lantern in hand, the shadows pressed in around her, as though the night itself sought to reclaim the secrets she had uncovered. She stood, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on her, urging her to leave before it was too late. Her legs trembled as she took the first step back towards the path, but the sense of urgency pushed her forward. She could feel the forest watching her, could sense the eyes that hid in the darkness between the trees, following her every movement. And as she walked back towards her cottage, she knew that she would return to the hollow again, that the secrets buried beneath the roots and shadows had not yet revealed their full shape. For now, though, she would retreat, carrying with her the knowledge that the woods held a darkness far older and far deeper than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 5. The Hollow Murmur. The night wrapped the forest in a thick blanket of darkness, so complete that even the familiar shapes of trees turned into shadowy specters. Sarah Bradford barely slept. Her dreams, when they came, were restless and fractured, filled with the flickering symbols from the hollow and the feeling of cold, clammy mist winding around her limbs like tendrils. She awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering in her chest. Unable to find any solace within the cottage, she decided to venture outside, hoping the fresh air might calm her thoughts. But the moment she stepped out onto the porch, she sensed that the night had not yet relinquished its hold. The air felt heavy with an unnatural chill, and a faint mist clung to the ground like a veil over the landscape. She could barely see beyond the edge of the tree line, where the forest loomed, dark and silent. The memory of yesterday's encounter with the shifting paths weighed on her, but curiosity, a relentless force she couldn't suppress, pulled her back toward the woods. She lit her lantern, the flame casting a small, quivering pool of light around her. The path leading into the forest seemed more treacherous in the pre-dawn darkness, the roots and rocks hidden beneath the blanket of mist. But she pressed forward, her footsteps soft against the earth, the forest's silence pressing in around her like a physical presence. As she moved deeper into the woods, she began to notice subtle changes. The trees here were older, their bark scarred and pitted as if from ancient battles with time and weather. The ground beneath them was littered with decaying leaves, their edges curled and brittle, crunching softly underfoot. The air held the scent of rot and something else, something metallic, like iron, that made her skin prickle with unease. The forest floor dipped gradually, leading her down towards the heart of the woods, where the trees grew so close together that they blocked out the sky entirely. She felt as though she was descending into another world, a place where the rules of time and nature twisted upon themselves. Here, the shadows seemed thicker, clinging to the trees like a second skin, and her lantern's light barely cut through the gloom. She reached a point where the path split into two, one trail leading down into a dense thicket, while the other veered towards a small, stony rise. She hesitated, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, as if the forest itself was offering guidance. But it was not the wind that caught her attention. It was a sound she couldn't quite place, a faint rhythm that seemed to come from beneath the earth. It was a deep, resonant thumping, like a distant heartbeat, pulsing slowly, methodically. The vibrations traveled through the soil beneath her feet, a steady rhythm that seemed to draw her towards the stony rise. She turned her lantern in that direction, the glow revealing a narrow path that wound between jagged rocks and twisted roots. She followed the sound, the rhythm growing louder with each step, filling the silence of the forest with its steady beat. The path narrowed further, forcing her to duck beneath low-hanging branches, their fingers clawing at her hair and clothes. The mist thickened, swirling around her legs, rising up to her waist like a cold, living thing. When she reached the top of the rise, she found herself standing before a mound of earth that protruded from the ground like the humped back of some ancient beast. The soil was loose and dark, as if freshly disturbed, and at its center was an opening, a narrow fissure in the earth that seemed to breathe out a chill that made her shiver. The thumping sound was louder here, reverberating up from the darkness within, and she realized with a jolt that it was coming from deep beneath the ground. She knelt beside the fissure, holding her lantern over the edge, peering into the darkness. The flame's light barely penetrated the gloom, revealing only a few feet of rough, uneven walls before it was swallowed up entirely. She leaned closer, straining to hear beyond the steady pulse of the subterranean beat, hoping to catch some hint of its origin. For a moment, she thought she heard something else, a faint murmur that rose and fell beneath the rhythm, like the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. But the sound was too muffled, too alien to decipher. She reached out, running her fingers along the edge of the fissure, feeling the cool, damp earth beneath her fingertips. As she touched the soil, a shock of cold ran through her, like the jolt of static electricity. She jerked her hand back, staring at her fingers, but there was no visible mark, no sign of what she had felt. Yet the sensation lingered, a tingling that crawled up her arm and settled at the base of her skull, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She rose to her feet, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable beneath the canopy of ancient trees. The heartbeat-like rhythm continued, unbroken, and she couldn't shake the sense that it was aware of her, that it pulsed in response to her presence. She took a step back from the mound, her mind racing with questions, but her instincts urged her to leave, to return to the safety of her cottage while she still could. Yet even as she turned away, her gaze lingered on the fissure, on the dark, gaping mouth that seemed to beckon her back. She wondered what lay beneath, what force could produce such a sound, such an unnatural pulse. But the thought of descending into that darkness, of following the sound into the bowels of the earth, filled her with a dread she could not ignore. She hurried back down the rise, her steps quickening, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist around her as she fled. The rhythm followed her, a faint echo that lingered at the edges of her hearing, growing softer with each step she put between herself and the mound. But it never faded entirely, as though it had imprinted itself onto her mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the forest floor. By the time she reached the path that led back to her cottage, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the trees, casting pale beams across the forest floor. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, but the sense of unease clung to her like a shadow, refusing to be shaken off. She glanced back over her shoulder one last time, half expecting to see something following her, but there was only the mist and the silence of the trees. As she returned to the cottage, she could still feel the faint thrum of the heartbeat beneath the earth, reverberating through her thoughts like a forgotten melody. It was as if the forest had shared a secret with her, a glimpse into a world that should have remained hidden, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the mystery of the forest was far from over, that it would continue to unravel in ways she could not yet comprehend. Back inside the cottage, she extinguished the lantern, the flame flickering out with a final, reluctant sigh. She stood at the window, staring out into the fog-draped woods, feeling the weight of the forest's silence pressing in once more. And in that silence, she could almost hear the whisper of the heartbeat, a promise that it would wait for her, deep beneath the earth, until she returned to uncover the truths buried in the shadows. Chapter 6. The Hollow's Hunger. The daylight that followed Sarah's eerie morning venture seemed to carry little comfort. The sun barely made a dent in the mist that clung to the woods like a second skin, and the air remained thick and heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. She went through the motions of her day, preparing a meager breakfast, tidying the cottage, checking her traps, but her mind never strayed far from the memory of the heartbeat beneath the earth. The sensation lingered, like a distant, pulsing hum that she couldn't shake. Even when she was inside the cottage, she felt it, muted but present, reverberating in her chest, like the dull echo of her own heartbeat. The feeling unnerved her, twisting the familiar comfort of her home into something strange and threatening. As the day crept forward, she found herself drawn again and again to the window, her gaze drifting towards the shadowed woods. Each time, she resisted the pull, telling herself that she had no reason to return to the hollow, to the fissure that seemed to throb with an unnatural life. But resistance could only last so long. By afternoon, the restlessness had become too much, and she found herself standing on the threshold of the cottage, staring out at the woods with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She grabbed her lantern, though the daylight had not yet faded. The light from the flame felt like a small comfort against the shadows that gathered under the canopy, where the sun's rays could not reach. With a deep breath, she stepped off the porch and followed the now familiar path, her feet carrying her deeper into the forest, each step a reluctant surrender to the call that pulsed through the ground. The path wound through the ancient trees, their gnarled roots snaking across the forest floor like veins. As she moved deeper, the air grew colder, as if the heart of the woods absorbed the warmth of the sun and kept it hidden away. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of a leaf or the distant crack of a branch. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. It was late afternoon by the time she reached the hollow again. The mist had thickened here, curling in the air like breath on a cold morning, hiding the ground beneath her feet. She approached the mound where she had found the fissure, her heart quickening as she saw that the soil around it looked different, disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out of the earth. The fissure gaped wider than before, a dark mouth that seemed to exhale cold air in rhythmic pulses. The heartbeat was louder here, a steady, insistent thrum that vibrated through the ground and up into her bones. She knelt beside the opening, holding her lantern over the edge, its glow revealing only more shadows and the rough contours of the hole. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something lay just beyond the reach of the light, something that watched her from the darkness. She studied the disturbed soil around the fissure, noticing deep grooves and claw-like marks etched into the earth. Her mind raced with possibilities. Animals, perhaps, drawn to the scent of fresh earth, or something older, something that had slumbered beneath the roots and now stirred to the surface. The thought made her shudder, but she forced herself to examine the marks more closely. They seemed too regular, too deliberate to belong to any animal she knew. The earth beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, as if the ground itself was loosening, giving way to whatever lay below. She reached out and touched the soil again, half expecting to feel that jolt of cold electricity, but this time it was different. The earth seemed to shift beneath her hand, like the slow, steady movement of something breathing beneath the surface. A wave of nausea rolled through her, and she stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. She fought to keep her balance, her mind spinning with the realization that whatever lay beneath the hollow was not content to remain buried. It was restless, straining against the layers of earth that held it in place, like a prisoner clawing at the walls of its cell. And she, Sarah realized with a sinking dread, had become its unwitting witness. She took a few shaky steps back, her eyes never leaving the dark maw of the fissure. The mist seemed to grow thicker around it, curling upwards like smoke from a dying fire, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent she had noticed earlier. It filled her nose, sharp and bitter, like the tang of blood or rust. She tried to shake the thought from her mind, but the image persisted, entwining itself with the rhythm of the heartbeat, the thumping that felt almost hungry. The ground beneath her shifted again, a subtle tremor that rippled through the soil and up her legs. She backed away further, unwilling to stay any longer in this place that felt as if it were on the verge of breaking open. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something glinting in the half-buried roots of a nearby tree, half hidden beneath the churned-up earth. She crouched down and brushed away the loose soil, revealing a small, tarnished locket, its chain twisted and tangled among the roots. It looked old, the metal worn smooth by time, but she could still make out the faint engraving on its surface, a pattern of spirals and symbols that matched the one she had seen etched into the stones of the hollow. She held it in her palm, feeling the cool weight of it, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath her, as if she stood at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss that had no end. She slipped the locket into her pocket, feeling its cold weight press against her thigh as she hurried back up the rise, away from the hollow's hungry maw. The mist seemed to cling to her clothes, following her like a shroud as she retraced her steps through the woods, the heartbeat's rhythm fading into the background but never disappearing entirely. When she reached the edge of the forest, she paused, turning back one last time to gaze at the shadowed hollow. The air was still, the mist swirling lazily in the pale afternoon light, but she could feel the thrum of the heartbeat beneath her, echoing through the soles of her boots, as if reminding her that the forest's secrets were not done with her yet. Back at the cottage, she placed the lantern on the porch, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch. Inside, she sank into her chair, feeling the tension slowly drain from her muscles, but the unease lingered, an itch just beneath her skin. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, turning it over in her hands, the faint spiral patterns catching the light. It felt like a message, a piece of a larger puzzle that she had yet to understand. She wondered if there had been others before her, those who had felt the call of the hollow, who had heard the heartbeat in the darkness and had gone in search of answers. And she wondered what had become of them, whether they had found what they were looking for, or whether the forest had swallowed them whole, leaving only traces like the locket behind. She placed the locket on the windowsill, where it caught the last light of the setting sun. As dusk settled over the woods, she listened for the heartbeat, straining to hear it beneath the wind and the rustling leaves. But there was only silence, deep and unbroken, as though the forest itself was waiting, holding its breath until she returned to face whatever lay beneath the earth. Chapter 7. A Path to Nowhere. The evening descended over the forest like a slow-moving shroud, wrapping the trees in shadows that lengthened and twisted across the ground. Sarah sat in the dim glow of her lantern, staring at the locket that she had placed on the windowsill, its tarnished surface gleaming faintly in the last of the day's light. Outside, the woods grew darker, the mist thickening as if it were gathering strength, filling the spaces between the trees with a dense, white fog. She felt the weight of the locket as if it were pulling her towards some hidden truth, dragging her thoughts back to the hollow with a relentless pull. The heartbeat she had felt beneath the earth seemed to reverberate in her chest, a steady thrum that matched the rhythm of her own pulse. It was as if the forest itself had become a living entity, its ancient roots reaching deep into the soil, down to where the unknown secrets lay buried. She could not shake the sense that she had become a part of something much larger, something that stretched back beyond her time in this place, beyond the memory of the trees that surrounded her. The locket in her hand felt like a piece of a puzzle, a key that might unlock the mysteries of the hollow. But she knew that whatever answers it held would not be found in the safety of her cottage. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah stood and picked up her lantern, feeling the weight of it in her hand as she stepped out onto the porch. The mist rolled around her feet like a living thing, coiling up the steps and swirling through the air. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, and started down the familiar path toward the forest's edge, her steps slow and measured. The darkness was complete by the time she entered the woods, the trees rising up like black pillars against the night sky. She moved carefully, her lantern casting long shadows that danced among the trunks, each flicker of light revealing the shifting shapes of the undergrowth. The mist made everything seem blurred and uncertain, turning the familiar path into a labyrinth of twisting roots and gnarled branches. She walked for what felt like hours, the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the stillness. Her thoughts churned with half-formed questions, images of the hollow and the strange marks she had found there. The air seemed to hum with an unseen energy, and every few steps she would pause, straining to hear that deep, resonant thrum that she knew pulsed somewhere beneath the ground. When she reached the hollow, the mist was so thick that she could barely see a few feet in front of her. The trees loomed like specters in the fog, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. She approached the mound slowly, feeling the ground grow softer beneath her feet, the earth shifting in a way that made her uneasy. The fissure in the ground had widened since she had last seen it, the edges crumbling away to reveal a deeper chasm. She held her lantern over the opening, the light barely piercing the darkness below. The heartbeat was louder here, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate through the very air. It was as though the ground itself was breathing, exhaling a cold, metallic scent that filled her nostrils and turned her stomach. She knelt beside the opening, placing her free hand on the ground. The soil was cold to the touch, the dampness seeping into her skin. As she held her hand there, she felt a faint vibration, a tremor that seemed to travel up through her bones. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a sense of movement, of something shifting far below the surface. The air grew colder still, and she wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her breath clouding in the light of the lantern. She leaned closer to the fissure, trying to peer into the darkness, her mind struggling to comprehend the depth of what lay beneath. The heartbeat grew louder, a steady, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the entire forest had become a living drum. Suddenly, the ground beneath her hand shifted, and she pulled back with a start. The soil seemed to ripple, as though something beneath it was pushing upward, straining against the weight of the earth that held it down. She scrambled back, her heart racing, but the ground stilled again, the movement fading as quickly as it had come. She stood up, clutching the lantern tightly, and took a step back, her mind racing with the implications of what she had felt. It was as if the forest was trying to reveal something to her, to draw her closer to the edge of a truth that she was not yet ready to face. She turned away from the fissure, her thoughts churning with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that she could not leave this place behind, not without understanding what lay beneath its surface. As she made her way back through the woods, the mist seemed to part before her, opening a narrow path through the shadows. She moved quickly, her breath coming in short bursts, each step echoing in the silence that surrounded her. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, as though the trees were closing ranks, their branches stretching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. By the time she reached the cottage, the first hint of dawn was breaking on the horizon, a faint glow that cast a pale light over the treetops. She placed the lantern on the porch and sank down onto the steps, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The heartbeat's rhythm had faded, but she could still feel it, a distant echo that pulsed through her veins, as though the forest had left its mark on her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, turning it over in her hands. The spiral engravings seemed to catch the light of the rising sun, casting long shadows across her fingers. She traced the patterns with her thumb, feeling the rough texture of the metal, and wondered what secrets it held, what stories it might tell of those who had come before her, drawn to the woods by the same haunting call. The air around her was still, but she sensed a tension in the forest, a quiet anticipation that seemed to hang in the mist like a held breath. She knew that she had crossed a threshold, that she had touched the edges of a mystery that went deeper than she could have imagined. And she knew, too, that the forest was not done with her. Not yet. As the sun crept higher, she rose from the steps and made her way inside, her thoughts swirling with questions that had no answers. She placed the locket on the table beside her bed, feeling its cold weight settle into the wood. She lay down, closing her eyes against the morning light, but the shadows of the forest lingered behind her eyelids, a dark and tangled web that she could not escape. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of twisting roots and whispering voices, of a forest that moved like a living thing, its breath mingling with hers. And through it all, she felt the steady, unyielding pulse of the heartbeat, a reminder that she had ventured too close to the truth, that the woods had awakened something that could not easily be put back to rest. Chapter 8: The Beckoning Silence. The morning light filtered weakly through the trees, its pale glow swallowed by the lingering mist that clung to the forest floor. Sarah awoke to the unsettling quiet, a silence that seemed to amplify the strange, otherworldly atmosphere that had settled over the woods. Her sleep had been restless, filled with fractured dreams of dark places, buried things, and a constant, rhythmic thudding that matched the beat of her heart. It left her with a sense of dread, a nagging feeling that whatever was unfolding in the woods was far from over. She rose from the bed, casting a wary glance at the locket resting on the bedside table. The morning chill seeped into the small cottage, and she wrapped herself in a heavy sweater, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind churned with half-formed thoughts as she moved about the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast that she barely touched. The forest outside seemed to be waiting, the trees swaying gently in a wind she could not feel, their leaves whispering secrets just beyond her hearing. After a while, she stepped onto the porch, breathing in the sharp, earthy scent of the damp woods. Her breath formed clouds in the air, mingling with the mist that swirled around her ankles. The stillness was absolute, a blanket of quiet that seemed to absorb every sound she made. She scanned the tree line, half expecting to see movement between the shadows, but the woods remained empty, a dark and endless labyrinth stretching out in all directions. She knew she could not stay at the cottage, not with the mystery of the hollow pulling at her thoughts like a magnet. The heartbeat she had felt beneath the ground had become a constant presence in her mind, an insistent rhythm that urged her back to the place where she had first sensed it. She filled a small satchel with a few supplies, tucked the locket into her pocket, and set off down the familiar path, her boots crunching through the undergrowth. The mist thickened as she moved deeper into the forest, rising in tendrils that wound through the trees, obscuring her vision and turning the world into a gray, shifting haze. She kept her steps steady, focusing on the path ahead, but the sense of being watched crept over her, prickling the back of her neck. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a distant twig, felt like a hidden presence lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The woods seemed different that morning, as if the landscape had subtly rearranged itself overnight. Trees she thought she recognized loomed taller, their branches twisting in unfamiliar patterns. The air had a damp, heavy quality, filled with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. It was as though the forest had absorbed the night's darkness, storing it deep within its roots and shadows, ready to spill it out at any moment. She reached the hollow by midday, the mist parting reluctantly as she approached. The ground felt softer here, the soil yielding slightly under her boots, as if the earth itself had been disturbed. The fissure gaped wider than before, the darkness inside it seeming to pulse in time with the heartbeat that echoed in her ears. She knelt beside the opening, holding her breath as she leaned closer, feeling the cool draft that rose from below. The heartbeat was louder here, a deep, resonant thudding that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It vibrated through the ground, through the air, through her own body, as though the forest had fused with her flesh, drawing her into its ancient rhythm. She closed her eyes and placed her hands flat on the ground, feeling the subtle tremors that rippled through the soil, the faintest hint of movement below. The locket in her pocket seemed to grow heavier, a cold weight pressing against her leg. She pulled it out, the metal cold against her skin, and held it above the fissure. The spiral engravings gleamed in the faint light, their twisting patterns seeming to shimmer with an inner glow. She felt a strange compulsion to lower the locket toward the darkness, to let it descend into the depths below. Her hand trembled as she held it there, caught between the fear of what she might awaken and the overwhelming need to understand. The ground beneath her hands shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver up her spine. It was as if something deep beneath the earth was stirring, stretching after a long slumber, pushing against the weight of centuries-old soil. She dropped the locket in her haste to pull back, and it fell into the fissure, disappearing into the shadows below with a soft clink. She froze, staring at the spot where the locket had vanished, her breath catching in her throat. The heartbeat quickened, a rapid pounding that seemed to match the frantic rhythm of her own pulse. The ground trembled beneath her, a subtle but unmistakable vibration that traveled up through her knees and into her bones. It was as though the forest had drawn a breath, preparing to exhale something ancient and terrible from the darkness. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The heartbeat faded to a distant thrum, a murmur that lingered at the edge of hearing. The air around her grew still, the mist settling back into the hollows of the forest, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. She could feel the shift in the air, the sense of anticipation that crackled through the trees like static electricity. She rose to her feet, her legs unsteady, and backed away from the fissure, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. What had she disturbed beneath the earth? What force had she called up from the depths? The locket was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and with it, any hope of understanding the strange connection she felt with the forest. She turned away from the hollow and began the long walk back to the cottage, her thoughts tangled with fear and a strange, morbid curiosity. The path seemed narrower than before, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches clawing at the sky. She moved quickly, her breath fogging in the chill air, the mist curling around her ankles like grasping hands. As she neared the cottage, she felt the ground shift again, a subtle shudder that rippled through the soil beneath her feet. She stopped and turned, looking back toward the hollow, but there was nothing to see. Only the mist and the shadows, blending together into a dark and seamless veil. She knew that whatever she had awakened was still out there, waiting, hidden beneath the earth. She reached the porch and paused, her hand on the railing, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers. She could hear the distant hum of the forest, a low and constant murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was a sound that spoke of old things, buried things, things that had waited in the darkness for far too long. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she caught her breath. The cottage felt small and fragile, a thin barrier against the vast, unknowable presence that loomed just beyond its walls. She knew she could not escape the pull of the forest, the compulsion that drew her back again and again to the hollow, to the heartbeat that thudded through the soil. She lit the fire and sat before it, staring into the flickering flames as they danced in the hearth. The warmth seeped into her bones, but it could not chase away the chill that lingered in her thoughts, the sense of something vast and ancient watching from the shadows. She wondered how long it would be before the forest called her back again, before the murmur of the earth became a roar that she could no longer ignore. And in the silence that followed, she thought she heard a faint sound beneath the crackle of the fire, a whisper, distant and indistinct, like the wind moving through the roots of the trees. It was a sound that sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder that the forest's secrets were far from uncovered, that the darkness beneath the earth had only begun to stir. Chapter 9. The Watcher's Return. The night settled over the forest like a heavy shroud, draping the trees in an inky darkness that swallowed sound and light. Sarah sat in the dim glow of the cottage, the crackling fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Despite the warmth of the flames, a chill had settled deep in her bones, an unsettling reminder of the hollow and the secrets it held. She could not shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to emerge from the depths of the woods. Sleep eluded her, the rhythmic heartbeat that pulsed through her mind growing louder with each passing moment. It resonated not just in the depths of the earth, but within her, entwining itself with her thoughts and dreams. Images of the hollow and the darkness below haunted her, mingling with memories of the locket, its intricate designs, the feeling of the cold metal against her skin, and the unsettling sense of connection it had offered. As the fire dwindled to embers, Sarah rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to peer into the night. The forest loomed just beyond the glass, a black wall of trees standing sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The mist swirled at their feet, weaving through the trunks like a ghostly river, and she felt the familiar tug of the woods, an insistent call that resonated deep within her. It was then that she saw it, movement at the edge of the trees. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow darting between the trunks, but as she strained her eyes to see better, it grew clearer. A figure, pale and indistinct, shifted among the trees, blending with the mist that wrapped around its form. It was there and gone in the blink of an eye, but the sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins, and her heart raced as she pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Drawing a deep breath, Sarah stepped back from the window, her mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her imagination fueled by fear and fatigue? Or was it something more? The forest had a way of playing with her perception, warping her senses until she could no longer trust her own eyes. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable, a sensation that prickled along her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. Unable to bear the uncertainty, she reached for her jacket, slipping it on and bracing herself against the chill that awaited her outside. The door creaked as she opened it, the cold air rushing in to greet her like a long-lost friend. She hesitated on the threshold, her instincts screaming for her to stay inside, yet the pull of the woods was too strong to resist. It beckoned her with an unspoken promise, a tantalizing mystery waiting to be unraveled. Stepping out onto the porch, Sarah felt the mist envelop her, thick and damp, curling around her ankles like ghostly fingers. The world was quiet, the sounds of the forest muted by the weight of the night. With every step she took, she felt the heartbeat beneath her feet, a steady thrum that called to her, urging her deeper into the woods. As she moved forward, the trees closed in around her, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a great beast. The path was slick with dew, and she carefully navigated the damp earth, her breath coming in soft puffs that vanished into the mist. The forest felt alive, every rustle of leaves and whisper of wind echoing with a sense of foreboding, as if it were aware of her presence and judging her worth. With each step, the figure returned to her mind, the pale shape lurking just beyond her sight. What had she seen? The thought twisted in her gut, mixing fear with an inexplicable need to understand. She pressed on, the thudding of her heart echoing the heartbeat in the ground, the two rhythms merging into one as she approached the hollow. As she neared the fissure, the air grew colder, a biting chill that sank into her skin. The darkness loomed before her, deeper than she remembered, and the heartbeat thrummed in her ears, a constant reminder of the life that lay hidden below. The ground around the hollow seemed to pulse with energy, the soil vibrating in response to her presence. She knelt, her hands resting on the damp earth, feeling the connection between her and whatever lay beneath. Suddenly, the soft, unearthly whispering began, a sound that curled around her, caressing her senses and drawing her closer to the edge. It was a sound she could not quite place, a mixture of voices that murmured in a language she did not understand. The tones were haunting, both beautiful and terrifying, weaving through the air like an ancient spell cast by the forest itself. Sarah felt the pull of the voices, an irresistible urge to listen more closely, to understand their meaning. It was intoxicating, enveloping her in a warm embrace that felt both safe and dangerous. She leaned closer to the fissure, straining to hear the words, but the deeper she delved into the shadows, the more the whispers eluded her grasp, slipping away like mist through her fingers. And then, as if the forest sensed her yearning, the pale figure emerged from the trees, stepping into the clearing. It was a woman, ethereal and haunting, her features barely discernible in the dim light. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, and her skin glowed with an otherworldly luminescence that illuminated the darkness around her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she beheld the apparition, the woman's presence radiating both warmth and an unsettling chill. The figure lifted her hand, gesturing toward the hollow with an elegance that seemed almost timeless. In that moment, Sarah felt a deep, unexplainable connection to the woman, a bond forged in the depths of the forest's secrets. The heartbeat beneath her feet quickened, echoing in rhythm with her own racing heart, as though urging her to step closer, to cross the threshold into the unknown. But as Sarah took a tentative step forward, the woman's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing with a hint of warning. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm, a cacophony of voices that filled the air with urgency. They pressed against Sarah's mind, urging her to listen, to heed the warning that echoed in the dark. Fear coursed through her veins, grounding her in reality. She took a step back, breaking the connection that had drawn her forward. The woman's gaze lingered, a mixture of sorrow and understanding that cut through the haze of the night. As the whispers faded, Sarah felt the heartbeat beneath her, pulsing softly as the forest sighed in resignation. The woman turned, retreating into the shadows, her form dissolving back into the mist as if she were made of the very essence of the forest itself. Sarah watched as she disappeared, a sense of loss washing over her. The whispers quieted, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of nocturnal creatures awakening in the darkness. Left alone in the clearing, Sarah felt the weight of the night pressing down on her, a reminder of the secrets that lay buried beneath the soil. The forest was alive with whispers, but they were no longer clear. The heartbeat pulsed softly beneath her, a reminder of the ancient connection she felt, a bond with something vast and unfathomable. With a heavy heart, she turned away from the hollow, the pull of the forest still lingering in her mind. But she knew she needed to return to the safety of her cottage. The woods were no longer just a backdrop. They were alive with stories, with voices that whispered in the dark, secrets waiting to be uncovered. But they also carried a weight of danger that she was only beginning to understand. As she made her way back through the trees, the mist swirling around her like a shroud. She glanced back at the hollow one last time. It stood silent, a yawning mouth waiting for its next offering, for the next soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to seek the truth hidden in the depths below. The journey home felt longer, the path shifting beneath her as if the forest itself was rearranging its secrets. And as she reached the porch of her cottage, the chill of the night lingered in the air, a reminder that she had only just begun to scratch the surface of the darkness that lay in wait. Chapter 10. The Final Cry. The dawn broke slowly over the horizon, casting a soft, pale light that filtered through the trees like a gentle embrace. The world outside was awakening, but Sarah remained in her cottage, cocooned in a thick blanket of anxiety and dread. The whispers of the night clung to her like a shadow, refusing to dissipate with the morning light. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window, where the forest stood silent and watchful, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. Her heart still raced from the encounter in the hollow, the apparition that had emerged from the depths of the woods. It felt surreal, a dream woven with threads of reality. The image of the pale woman lingered in her mind, her silvery hair and luminous skin etched into Sarah's thoughts. She could almost hear the whispers again, their haunting melody weaving through her consciousness, echoing the fears she tried to push away. As the sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air, Sarah resolved to confront the darkness that loomed just beyond her doorstep. She felt a pull, a magnetic force urging her to return to the hollow, to delve deeper into the mystery that had enveloped her life since she first set foot in the woods. But the thought sent a shiver down her spine, fear battling with curiosity in a tumultuous clash within her heart. After dressing in layers, Sarah stepped outside, the cool morning air invigorating her senses. The ground was damp with dew, glistening under the rising sun. She took a deep breath, inhaling the earthy scent of the forest, feeling its call echo through her very being. Each step toward the hollow felt like crossing a threshold into another world, one that promised both revelation and peril. The forest was alive, the rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds providing a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the night before. But as she ventured further, the path became increasingly familiar, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of the woods. She recalled the footsteps that had led her here, each echo a reminder of the connections she had made, both with the forest and the spectral presence within it. When she reached the clearing, the hollow lay before her, a dark, yawning abyss that seemed to pulse with life. The mist swirled around its edges, curling like smoke as though the earth itself were exhaling, and Sarah felt the anticipation building within her. She approached the edge, her heart racing with each step, the whispers growing louder in her mind, coaxing her closer. Peering into the depths, she felt a strange compulsion to descend into the darkness, to uncover the secrets that lay hidden below. With a deep breath, she knelt at the edge of the hollow, the earth cold against her skin. As she reached out, the whispers crescendoed, an overwhelming tide of sound that surged through her, echoing the heartbeat that had once resonated beneath her feet. As she leaned closer, the ground shifted beneath her, the soil crumbling slightly. She froze, her heart pounding, feeling the pull of the hollow beneath her. It was as if the earth was alive, an ancient creature stirring in its slumber, ready to reveal its secrets. Just then, a faint glow emerged from the depths, a soft, pulsing light that illuminated the darkness, revealing shapes that swirled in the void. Fascination battled with fear as Sarah leaned closer, her breath hitching in her throat. The light flickered like candle flames caught in a draft, casting eerie shadows against the walls of the hollow. The shapes danced within the light, morphing and shifting, hinting at something alive and waiting just out of reach. For a moment, She could almost see the outlines of faces, their expressions contorted with anguish and longing, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Sarah's breath quickened, the thrill of discovery surging within her, but it was soon overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of dread. The figures seemed to extend their hands toward her, reaching out as if trying to grasp her soul, and she felt the weight of their despair pressing against her. The whispers grew louder, melding into a single voice that spoke directly to her heart, a warning wrapped in sorrow. The heartbeat intensified, resonating within her, and she stumbled back, panic flooding her senses. The forest closed in around her, the once comforting embrace of nature now feeling suffocating. The sunlight grew dim, the shadows deepening as if the trees were leaning closer, their gnarled branches reaching out to ensnare her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the eyes of the forest watching her every move. Struggling to compose herself, Sarah took a step back, retreating from the edge of the hollow. The figures in the light shifted, their forms flickering like candle flames, but she refused to look away. The sorrow in their eyes mirrored her own fear, a connection she could not ignore. She realized then that they were not merely shadows. They were echoes of those who had come before her, souls lost to the forest, trapped in its embrace, yearning for release. With newfound resolve, Sarah stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers called to her, but this time she focused on the warmth within her, the strength she had discovered through her journey. The hollow may have been a portal to darkness, but it was also a gateway to understanding. She could no longer turn her back on the truth waiting to be uncovered. As she looked deep into the hollow, she felt a shift in the air, a stirring of energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The light pulsed again, illuminating the figures that hovered just beyond her grasp. She had a choice to make, to dive deeper into the unknown or to walk away, leaving the voices to whisper in the dark forever. Gathering her courage, Sarah took a step forward, drawn by an unseen force. The heartbeat echoed in her ears, steady and reassuring, guiding her through the fear that threatened to engulf her. She extended her hand, feeling the warmth radiating from the light, and the moment her fingertips grazed the surface of the hollow, a wave of energy surged through her. The figures stirred, their expressions shifting from despair to hope, and the whispers transformed into a harmonious melody that filled the air. It was as if the forest itself rejoiced at her decision, the trees swaying gently in response. Sarah felt the pulse of the hollow intertwine with her own, the boundaries between them dissolving as she embraced the light. And in that moment, she understood. The hollow was not merely a void. It was a vessel of memories, a sanctuary for those lost to the woods. The souls within were not seeking vengeance. They longed for recognition, for someone to acknowledge their existence and the stories they carried. By stepping forward, Sarah had given them a voice, and in return, she had found her own. As the figures reached out, their hands intertwining with hers, Sarah felt a surge of warmth envelop her. The darkness that had once loomed so ominously began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of peace that radiated from the hollow. The whispers transformed into a gentle lullaby, soothing her fears and wrapping her in a comforting embrace. With tears in her eyes, Sarah knew that her journey had come full circle. The forest had opened its heart, revealing its secrets, and she had become a part of its tapestry. The echoes of the hollow would forever be intertwined with her soul, a reminder of the strength that lay within her and the power of connection that transcended time and space. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the forest, Sarah took a step back from the hollow, the light within still flickering softly. The figures smiled, their expressions filled with gratitude, and she felt a deep sense of belonging, as if she had finally found her place among them. With the forest as her witness, she turned to leave, knowing that she would carry the stories of the lost souls with her. The voices would forever echo in her heart, guiding her on her journey through life. A reminder of the magic that resided in the woods, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to listen. As she stepped away from the hollow, the forest sighed, its heartbeat settling into a gentle rhythm that mirrored her own. Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose as she walked back through the trees, the shadows lifting from her shoulders, the weight of the past finally released. The woods were alive, and she had become a part of its eternal story, a guardian of its whispers, a keeper of its secrets.